Hello, joining us today, I have Katie Stallard, the New Statesman senior editor in Washington, D.C., who is going to bring us up to date on Tuesday night's VP debate between JD Vance and Tim Walz. Katie, thank you so much for joining us. Obviously, the elephant in the room with this is VP debates don't often matter all that much. And actually, it seems like this time around, the VP candidates are getting a lot more attention than in usual elections. Do you think that this debate will have an impact one way or another?
I predict that in a year's time, and likely much sooner than that, we will not be able to remember very much about this debate at all. I think what we see from the history of past VP debates, they generally matter very little at all in terms of the overall polls. Where they have had a slight impact and where this could, at the margins, come to matter is in terms of the perception of the candidates. I think it's just the nature of the VP nominees that often this is the forum where they get, in this case, 90 minutes in primetime television to introduce themselves to the American public. So you saw both Vance and Walz desperately trying to backfill their own biography into completely unrelated answers on Iran, Israel, and the crisis in the Middle East. So I think where it can matter is in terms of voter perceptions and particularly voter favorability. And I think that was clearly Vance's number one aim. And I think he did achieve it to some extent in this. He is a historically unpopular choice for a vice presidential nominee. And I think this was his chance to show TV viewers, I'm not as bad as you've read in the liberal media. He went out of his way to be cordial, to be polite, to express sympathy for Tim Walz. So I think at the margins, we might see a little bit of an improvement in his currently very, very poor favorability ratings. But ultimately, this was more about not doing harm to the top of the ticket and not doing, as we saw in the first presidential debate this year, debates matter if they go spectacularly wrong. If they, broadly go along as Tuesday night's debate did, then I think really it was a matter of passing this test, showing that they could perform in this forum and trying not to do harm to Donald Trump or Kamala Harris.
I mean, it's worth remembering that for millions of Americans, this will kind of be their first introduction to both of these individuals. But tone-wise, it did feel very different from both the Trump-Biden debate that, as you said, went spectacularly wrong for Biden, and then the Trump-Harris debate, which seemed to go quite wrong for Donald Trump. It was more polite. I mean, they actually talked about policy, right?
Right. Yeah, within the first 10, 15 minutes, there was more policy than you got in the entirety of the previous presidential debate. And it was sort of, people have talked about this as a sort of nostalgic blast from the past of, remember when presidential candidates used to pretend to get along, used to pretend that they were interested in meeting in the middle. So, it was a contrast from that respect. And I think that was very deliberate. As I say, on the Vance side, I think this was about showing I'm not the extremist MAGA bomb thrower that you may have read about. I actually am interested in you and your family, and I'm interested in working towards the middle. And it was interesting to hear him say, and they both said at times, I actually agree with Governor Walz on much of this. I think Senator Vance is interested in tackling this problem. So it was much more conciliatory, but that was deliberate. That is because both of these candidates are trying to show they're likable, they can work in a bipartisan way, they're stable, they're reasonable. So it isn't a coincidence that these two politicians presented themselves in that way.
Although that said, there was a moment when both of their mics got muted, wasn't there?
Right. Yes, I think this is one of the few moments that will live on from this debate, which was one of the agreed rules, is that if they need to, the moderators will have the ability to cut the mics. And at a point where JD Vance and Tim Walz were arguing with each other, and then JD Vance started arguing with the moderators, Margaret Brennan, one of the moderators, cut them off.
Gentlemen, the audience can't hear you because your mics are cut.
So I think we will see a clip of that going around on social media. And I think, broadly, they did a pretty good job of keeping this on the rails, keeping it focused. And as you said, really pressing for details on actual policy rather than, what we saw before with these very broad, very abstract, very culture warrior type debate.
Well, Freddie Hayward is also in Washington, and he covered it for the New Statesman website in the immediate aftermath. And he wrote that JD Vance won the debate, and he sort of puts that in the context of, I think, the uphill climb that Vance had because of his controversial comments previously and his unpopularity more generally. The Snap poll that I saw straight after showed audiences were quite mixed, sort of 41 each way, and quite a few still undecided. Who do you think won, or what even are the metrics by which one of the candidates could win in a debate, which, as you say, in a couple of months' time we'll all have forgotten about?
So I think if you watch this from beginning to the end over the full 90 minutes and you were judging it on who is the better debater, hands down, JD Vance won. He looked very comfortable. He's a very accomplished performer. He's a very smart guy who's very used to debating ideas, engaging people he considers to be hostile. He was very comfortable. He was very disciplined. The frustration that Democrats had with Biden in the first debate in terms of not being able to prosecute a case against Trump, that is the same. That's the same issue that a lot of Republicans have with Donald Trump. Is if only he would stick to his script, if he would get to his talking points, if he would prosecute the case against Harris as an incumbent, as how they want to see a representative of the Biden administration, you can make a very strong case against Kamala Harris. And that's what JD Vance did. So he accomplished that aim. He presented himself as a kind of calm, rational, relatively reasonable individual. But he did it by, I think, a charitable way to put it would be bending the truth. At times he outright lied. He said that he had never been in favor of a national abortion ban. He has several times said that he's in favor of a national abortion ban. He really twisted the truth, and it was really striking that he refused to say, when asked directly, that Donald Trump lost the last presidential election. So I think it depends how you watch this. And for the majority of Americans and the majority of voters who will look at summaries of this the morning after, who will see clips circulated on social media, you'll see what you want to see. You'll see that clip of JD Vance refusing to say that Donald Trump lost the election. You'll see some of Tim Walz's stronger answers. As the debate went on, I mean, honestly, he looked very flustered, very nervous, slightly bewildered during the opening answers. He confused Israel and Iran. He misspoke. He called himself a knucklehead. It was not a strong debate performance, but this also wasn't his format. He wasn't picked to be the vice presidential nominee because he was seen as a competent debater. And he bore that out. This was, if you are somebody who is trying to answer the question, who is a reasonably, earnest politician who's grappling with these issues. He seemed to be really struggling to do that, to answer the questions directly, to bring in his own personal experience. It just doesn't work at all in this format. But if what you see and what voters like in Walz is a sort of progressive, thoughtful, very experienced, very passionate guy, then you saw that. And the polls that you quoted are the only polls that we have at this point. The Snap polls that came out right afterwards show it was 50-50, that Democrats overwhelmingly thought that Walz won. Republicans overwhelmingly thought that Vance won. Interestingly, independents tended to think that Walz won. So I think what it shows above all is how divided this electorate is, how few undecided voters there are, and how much of a kind of Rorschach test this election has become. So if you went into this thinking that JD Vance was a threat to abortion rights and women's freedoms in America, you came out of that having heard him articulate that. If you came into this thinking Walz was too progressive, there was nothing in this debate that would have changed your mind. So I think people will have seen what they wanted to see in it. And I think at the margins, as I say, maybe this slightly changes people's views of the favorability of either of them. But overall, I think you come out of it broadly still divided along the partisan lines that were there at the start.
I want to come back to JD Vance's comments on whether or not Trump won or lost the 2020 election, because I think that's really significant going into this one. But just before we do, you've talked about how Tim Walz isn't the most polished forensic debater, and that isn't his forum. Obviously, he has other strengths. He's been used as kind of like the warm-up act for rallies and things, and obviously he came up with the line that JD Vance is weird, and sort of Republicans are a bit weird, whereas he seems sort of quite normal and authentic. But do you think that actually there would have been other picks that could have challenged at that debate level more successfully? Was that an error, not seeing that perhaps this would be a weak spot for him from the Democrats?
Well, I am going to say an unpopular thing, which is that I was Team Josh Shapiro for vice presidential pick. Very popular governor of Pennsylvania, not because of the debate, because really this election is going to come down to who can carry Pennsylvania. And while the governor of a state might only move it a half a point or a percentage point in general election terms, this election is going to be so close that I thought the candidate that gives you the best chance of carrying Pennsylvania is the person you should go for. And I think Josh Shapiro's strength, which also you see in Pete Buttigieg, who are both acting at the moment as very high-profile candidates for the Harris campaign, I think you would have seen a very different debate. I think you would have seen the Democratic nominee really able to take JD Vance to task, really able to engage him on the details of his arguments, really able to prosecute the case against Vance and Trump in a way that Walz just wasn't. And I think that the marginal harm it does to Walz was part of his sort of star power was this sense that he is uniquely charismatic. He unites Democrats. He wasn't going to alienate people who thought that Josh Shapiro was too pro-Israel. There was nobody that had a problem with Tim Walz, and he was seen as a star performer on TV. He was someone who was relatable. He had that sort of Midwestern dad vibe. And I think last night you saw what happens when the rubber meets the road, as the phrase goes here, and you have him up against a very experienced Yale Law School educated TV performer, podcast veteran, right wing ideologue. He wasn't a match for JD Vance in terms of debating prowess in a way that I think a Shapiro or a Buttigieg could have been. So I think, it's all going to depend what happens in, I think, 33 days time from now. If Harris wins this election, we will never talk about this debate again. If she loses, I think we will look back at this as an example of what could have been if she had chosen otherwise, and it was Shapiro instead of Walz up against JD Vance.
Well, the one moment when Vance did get a little bit unstuck was that question about whether Trump lost the 2020 election, and he said he didn't want to talk about it. He wanted to talk about the future. Walz said that was a damning non-answer. Obviously, this is a bit of a sore point for Republicans in general, who, if they want to stay on the right side of Trump, cannot admit, at least publicly, that he lost that election. And then obviously there are questions about January 6th, the insurrection, and obviously we covered that on the podcast last week. How significant is that as an issue to undecided, independent swing voters? The fact that you've got two people on the ticket who still bring up 2020 as if they should have won or they did win, and where there are actually questions about what will happen in November if the Democrats win and whether that result will be accepted.
I think it should be a flashing red warning light for anyone who is concerned about what follows this election in November. I think it is JD Vance saying in the clearest possible terms, he is still not going to concede publicly that Donald Trump lost the last election. And I think we should expect them both to behave exactly the same way. If Harris wins this election, I think we're already seeing the groundwork being put into place to undermine the results, to challenge the vote count where possible. And I think it was really telling. Vance is very flexible in the way he answered questions. He really contorted himself to come across as reasonable, as not repellent to voters. But on the question of whether Donald Trump lost, he can't do otherwise because he knows that Donald Trump is watching. He knows that he can't say to the audience of one, yes, the game is up. You did, in fact, lose the 2020 election. So he can't answer the question. And it was a damning non-answer. I mean, it was, I think I laughed out loud when he said, Tim, I'm focused on the future. In response to a very straight, very direct question. Is my understanding that was already then overnight being cut into a new advert for the Harris campaign. You're going to see a lot of that. And that, that is one of the most compelling reasons that Trump chose Vance, is because he is, of the people who are being considered for his vice presidential nominee, Vance was the one who had indicated that he would have tried to consider alternate slates of electors. He would have investigated the possibilities for not certifying the results of the last election in the way that Mike Pence ultimately did. So I think you saw in those 10 seconds this very revealing glimpse of Vance's true colors. That's who he is. That's where he stands on election integrity. And there's no reason to think he would behave differently this time around. The only caveat I will add to that is democracy just isn't at the top, consistently when voters are asked what are their top election issues. It's up there. It's generally in the top 5, but it's the economy, the cost of living, it's inflation, it's immigration, and it's abortion. If democracy is your key issue, this will push you firmly away from Vance. But for most voters, and particularly in these, it's 6, maybe 7 key states that this is going to come down to, it still looks like primarily this is going to be on economy, cost of living, and immigration. So I think we should take those comments very seriously, but we shouldn't expect that to be decisive in its own right.